Thank you for joining us in this last session of the day. I'm Catherine Duncan, and you'll be hearing from my colleague Kate Bernberg. We're both teachers and coordinators at various different levels in the course Film, Visual and Performing Arts, which is a major in the School of Arts, and it's offered by the Departments of Interdisciplinary Arts and Culture Studies. Our presentation today should really be understood as being the very opening beat of what will be a much longer cycle of research and reflection on a recent course review and redesign that we've undertaken. So we have no firm conclusions or even concrete observations at this stage, and so we'd be very glad to have your input as we think through what we've started, why, and how it's going in these very early days. So with that in mind, I'll kind of start our presentation. So the last decade in both South Africa and indeed globally has highlighted that higher education is in a state of disruption that is not the exception, but is rather the norm. Mm-hmm. And by reflecting on our responses to disruption in a large undergraduate course, we argue that curriculum resilience requires negotiating divergences primarily in how staff and students understand teaching and learning, and developing some experience-based solutions for access and how students and staff are able to access this new normal. And that primarily curriculum design requires working with rather than against instability in this phase of teaching and learning.
And I'm just checking that my slide has changed and that it's all working fine. Is that correct? We all see the next slide.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Fantastic. So hi, everybody. My name's Kate. I've worked in film, visual and performing arts, or we use the acronym FEPA1, in various roles since 2011. And I was the course coordinator for FEPA1A this year. So FEPA1 is the largest course in the Wits School of Arts, enrolling between 250 and 350 students each year. Because of that scale and because it cuts across all the professional degrees in the school, it inevitably becomes a focal point for wider debates about what we teach, how we teach, and what we expect from first-year students entering higher education. The course was originally envisioned as a trans and interdisciplinary theory course, a course all arts students would take, regardless of whether they were studying film, music, fine art, theatre, or digital arts, and it sits within the general BA as a possible major as well. Since its launch in the mid-2000s, FEPA1 has been through several redesigns, but it has retained a fairly traditional architecture. We had 2 double face-to-face lectures and a 45-minute tutorial each week. Its assessments have typically combined longer essays with shorter text-based or applied analyses. Students write about theory, but also test it against a film or a piece of music or an artwork, a game or a performance. The disruptions of the past decade, including Fees Must Fall, emergency remote teaching, and the launch of OpenAI, have necessitated many emergency interventions, and many of these continue in our context of infrastructure instability. This has forced us to consider more sustainable interventions for long-term instability. However, by most conventional measures, this course is already a success. Our concern and the real challenge that frames today's discussion is about access and participation and how we design for equity, resilience, and meaningful engagement when disruption itself has become the norm. However, it continues to be the focus of concerns about student performance, the development of academic literacies, the extent to which it foregrounds decolonial content and method, and engagement at the undergraduate level. So these factors led us to redesign the course, to launch a series of consultations and discussions for course redesign in late 2023 through 2024.
So making extensive changes to a curriculum, particularly one as central and as scrutinized as FEPA1, is always attended by anxieties. And the events of the past decade have often forced FEPA staff to introduce temporary strategies. And the course has tended to pivot towards interventions that are governed by what is most pressing in the moment. And given our experience for the last 10 years and anticipating these ongoing waves arriving from the poly crisis that we find ourselves in, we've decided that applying best practices in teaching and learning really requires a resilient curriculum, and that we shouldn't be tempted to walk back interventions in the face of new disruptions or give into the call to a return to a pre-crisis version of the course, that in fact the crisis has been an excellent teacher. However, at the same time, the curriculum needs to have built-in flexibility to respond to ongoing changes in our cohorts, our contexts, and the wider shifts in higher education here and globally. So one of the most obvious challenges we faced is, as Kate's already mentioned, is scale. FEPA caters to around 300 students this year, and I think perhaps the larger point is that a large class inevitably puts pressure on resources, but at the same time, there's a multiplier effect of the acute growing mental and physical health issues students face, financial factors like transport costs that we heard about earlier, the need to do paid work while studying full time in order to survive, disruptions through load shedding, water, public transport, protest, and importantly, also a late start for students who are dealing with funding shortfalls and delays in registration, especially in that first year, first week, which is a very kind of important moment in a student's academic career. So the key point was also made in this morning's sessions that infrastructural pressures are not only institutional but contextual, and the same difficulties that students face, staff encounter, and they're compounded by the wider precarity of Johannesburg itself. The city's instability has become part of the hidden curriculum that we're having to navigate and anticipate. In balancing student needs, we've also tried to be attentive to the well-being and sustainability for staff. So having to adapt and adopt to the technical demands of blended learning continues to mean a substantial workload increase in professional development and upskilling requirements, as well as significant additional workload to revise and ready materials for courses so that they have a meaningfully blended and interactive intervention. Overteaching and overassessing tends to weaken the quality of feedback while increasing the labor for both tutors and lecturers. So the assessment policies are also something that we've had to grapple with as part of this redesign. And then there are also the anxieties around generative AI, which unfortunately they risk pulling us back into deficit discourses and adversarial assessment, which we don't think is necessary at all. We don't want to go into those policing relationships with students rather than encouraging the possibilities for authentic or reflective learning practices. But perhaps most challenging are the tensions around what should be taught. Staff and students hold divergent expectations. Some emphasize interdisciplinarity, decoloniality, epistemic diversity, while others argue for more canonical content or much greater alignment with professional courses. Students often ask why this interdisciplinary course matters to their degrees. And these disagreements remind us that curriculum redesign is never just about content or delivery. It's a form of institutional change, surfacing philosophical differences, anxieties, and sometimes outright resistances.
So in response to these disruptions, our most important changes that we made this year have been structural. We began with a flipped classroom model, which we trialed in 2021 and 2022, and this shifted a portion of the traditional lecture load online. So students now engage with a short recorded lecture or reading with an accompanying online task before each week begins. These tasks are usually multiple choice questions or short responses or creative submissions, and they are given to students, they give students a first encounter with the material at their own pace. So when they arrive for their face-to-face discussion session on a Monday, we can use the large group sessions for discussion and extension and debate rather than using it as a kind of transmission moment. At the same time, we've halved the lecture hours and doubled our tutorial time. So the old 45-minute tutorials have now become 90-minute labs with around 40 students per class. This means we have to have larger groups, which isn't ideal, but the longer duration allows tutors time to run structured activities, in-class writing, and collaborative projects. This transforms our tutorials from spaces of passive recap into more active learning workshops where students practice academic literacies. Our assessment design has followed the same logic. Rather than rewarding rote reproduction, we focus on induction into academic practices. So early tasks emphasize process and reflection. For instance, we have the selfie project that uses image making to explore the theoretical concept of representation. We have multimodal tasks, oral presentations, group posters, and analog activities that sit alongside writing, reflecting our commitment to multiliteracies and to valuing multiple modes of knowledge. We also experimented with ways to manage emerging threats. Sorry, I just changed my slide. Some assessments are AI-proofed by design, so that they involve personal reflection, in-person explanation, or multimodal production. Group projects, which were abandoned in the past because of issues with conflict between students, were reintroduced this year through a student-generated code of conduct that the students made to set the terms for engagement. And strikingly, across almost 300 students this year, we only had one group that needed formal mediation. Flexibility has also been formalized, so we have an extended flexibility policy, which allows students in crisis to make up assessments later in the semester. And this is a measure that's actually seldom used, but it greatly reduces student anxiety. We've also modularized the course by appointing quarterly module leaders, and this has tightened alignment between the lectures, the labs, and the assessments, while also making the course more agile. So the content of a whole section or term can be assessed at a standalone moment, which makes for an intensive quarter, but provides some relief for students as well as staff who can wrap up their contribution, and in future would allow for the course as a whole to be adapted or rearranged without collapsing the overall structure. So taken together, these shifts make FEPA1 less brittle. They don't eliminate disruption, but they make the course more resilient, more equitable, and more responsive.
Okay, and again, bearing in mind that we are only 6 months into the rollout of this design for the course, and we still have to see how the second semester will unfold, we're reasonably happy with the kind of first indications. The class average has remained relatively high at 60 in the high 60s, and the pass rate has remained stable. We see these as positive signs in the face of a big curriculum shift. The work that was produced has been of a very high standard and consistently and across the board. Attendance in face-to-face classes has been excellent. And while we don't take formal attendance registers in larger classrooms, over the last couple of years, and I think this is reflected quite broadly, it's become typical to have kind of poor attendance in in-person large classes, with only a third or less of the class sometimes coming to those lectures. So it's been an extremely pleasant surprise to see a major uptick in class attendance, with the lecture room often at capacity in this first semester, and this attendance remained comparatively high across both modules without that very kind of steep drop-off that we were seeing towards the end of the semester. And then again, while student evaluations are not necessarily an indication of a course's success, particularly as many of our students are taking a large academic course like this for the first time and have no real groundwork for comparison, the evaluations that we've received on the whole have been extremely positive and indicate that students have appreciated the course structure, felt that it was well-resourced and well-supported, and that it enabled them to engage effectively with the course content.
So while we recognize that marks are not necessarily an indicator of learning, and the methods of assigning marks is an issue we would really like to interrogate more in future, they can perhaps tell us a little bit about how our diverse student body is being impacted by these disruptions and the subsequent redesign in terms of their overall performance. So on the left of the screen are the throughput rates for FEPA1 from 2015 to 2025. While the pass rate has been largely consistent, the pass rate for the redesigned curriculum in 2025 is the highest we've had in the past 10 years. And the marks average dropped slightly this year from a high of 69% in 2024 to 66% in 2025. But still, this is a healthy class average and the second highest that we've had in the past 5 years. In terms of student participation, which we track through lab attendance and the completion of online tasks each week, participation has been high. 84% of the students participated at least 16 or more times out of a possible 21 participation moments, and 98% of our students participated in at least half or more of these moments.
Right. So starting to wrap this up. Up to this point, we've outlined the pressures we've been under, large classes, infrastructural instability, staff workload, and divergent expectations. And we recognize that none of these are going away. In fact, what we've come to accept is that disruption itself is the baseline that has reconfigured how we teach and learn. FEPA1 has often been debated in terms of content and literacies, and these debates matter. But in practice, we found that interventions in these areas only succeed when they're anchored in structural design, and that it's this and not just content that makes space for access, participation, and resilience. Our traditional touchstones of authenticity, constructive alignments, and active learning are still important, but they were being consistently outpaced by the messiness of the context we found ourselves in. So we've shifted towards what Waldeck and colleagues describe as resilience, while also noting that we have some real reservations about the purpose and politics of that term. But in this context, what we mean is four things: the ability to recover quickly and keep teaching running smoothly in disruption, to intervene proactively rather than reactively, to treat crisis as a potentially generative rather than purely obstructive factor, and to resist the temptation to return to business as usual when we hit the stable periods, and instead use disruption as an opportunity for meaningful change. Real curriculum resilience for us is inseparable from access and participation. And designing resilient curricula means that we're ensuring that students are not just passing, but are able to meaningfully participate in their education. For our redesign process, a set of emerging principles have begun to take shape. And this is emphasized that they've begun to take shape. We'll see how they continue. First of all, is to be responsive and transparent, building the capacity to deliver content in different ways and meeting students where they are, rather than working from a kind of deficit model. Our aim is to design curricula that work for a diverse and shifting student cohort in a fluctuating context where that context impacts differently on different lives. Second, access must be guided by curricula, access must guide curricular decisions, both in the practical sense of how a resource is available, but also in the epistemic sense of valuing and rewarding diverse literacies, languages, and ways of knowing. Thirdly, participation has to be enabled and recognized, and when it is happening, rewarded. That means offering varied routes to engagement, active and dialogic learning moments, but also valuing the life worlds that students bring as they enter new knowledge domains. Fourthly is flexibility. building multiple routes to participation, allowing for extended or alternative structures, and designing in what we're calling productive wastage, or resources that may not always be used but can be mobilized in moments of instability or necessity. Fifth, flexibility for students needs to be mirrored by flexibility for instructors. A resilient curriculum depends on staff capacity, and this demands slack in the form of some degree of redundancy and time for constant reskilling and recognition, reward, and support for the labor of teaching. Finally, we emphasize a long horizon approach that allows interventions to be worked through and reiterated. Curricula should be stable enough to weather disruption, responsive to context and cohort, open to critique, but at the same time supported in good faith. So structure more than content is what enables access, participation, and epistemic justice, and ultimately resilience. And I think at that note, we've come to the end of our presentation, and we would be very glad to have comments and suggestions and any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Well, thanks so much, Neo. Thanks for that inspiring presentation. It's so nice to hear how you've really kind of come to grips with so many of the challenges and given almost concrete meaning to your very sound, pedagogical principles and values that come through. Yeah, I mean, it's heartening to hear that there've been such positive, it seems as if there's definitely been an impact in this careful redesign process, and students seem to be engaging, which is great, and participating. Often, and I really like the way you kind of centering, we've heard a bit about it today in other contexts, learning being centered and not being driven by either the technology or fear of AI, but finding ways around it. One of the things I wanted to ask you was about the way you working with students to negotiate criteria, assessment criteria, and I think you referred to this as co-forming criteria, and as a way of also moving, countering this temptation to go back to old practices. And I just wanted to, if you could just elaborate on how you've done this, because it is tricky. You've got a large class, and it would be great to hear how you've involved students much more centrally in this process, where they feel they really, understand what's expected and issues of transparency and connectedness of the assessment criteria. Thanks.
Sure. So, do you mind?
No.
So, it's definitely not something we're doing to the extent that we would like to. So we definitely need, I think this was the first iteration of the redesign course this year, and we did a lot. And I think what we've learned from this experience is that we can build a little bit more slack in terms of the pacing of how we're doing things. So we do share our rubrics with students in advance of every single assessment. One of the things we trialed this year was giving students, for example, an essay question in advance of sitting down to answer that essay question, so that they've got time to work on it and brainstorm it and consult before they come to the moment of sitting and writing. But that process, we would like it to be a lot more consultative and collaborative. So we are very interested in ideas around grading and the negotiation of criteria and rubrics. I've trialed it myself once last year, but in a very constrained way, and there wasn't really time for students to wrap their head around what it would mean to speak back to that rubric, because they have to understand what they have to do in order to understand how that rubric does or does not work for them for that particular assessment. So we've done some small things, but I think it's something we would definitely like to expand in our workshop sessions, in our discussion sessions, and build a bit more kind of time in the curriculum to really unpack that more carefully with students. I don't know, Catherine, if you agree.
I absolutely. One of the things that I would say is that it's precisely a moment like that, and your question, Laura, really goes to the heart of why we felt that we had a structural problem rather than necessarily a content problem, because to do that kind of work requires small groups. It requires lots of time, and so that's precisely what motivated us to shift and double our tutorial time and let students work with tutors for a much longer period, because working out and negotiating with a group what the terms of reference are for a group project is not something that can be rushed. It requires that kind of slow process. And then, of course, none of those things would be possible without our amazing tutors, which becomes another structural question. It's about having budgets. It's about having available people. It's about the training that happens before those tutors walk into those rooms. So all of these things, all of these kind of transformation are premised on kind of really nuts and bolts possibilities that we keep coming back to, is that you can do just about anything if you have got the kind of structural resources in place to make those possible. So all of the things that Kate has mentioned, but we're actually finding, so for instance, you mentioned the AI kind of engagement of students, and ironically, in order to do good, meaningful, non-scary, policing, punitive work around AI at an undergraduate level, we're discovering that you actually need an awful lot of time face-to-face, talking about things in a classroom, engaging with students' anxieties, all of those sorts of things, which we understand and we recognize that it's exactly the same for staff. But you know, those become structural resource issues rather than necessarily simply finding the silver bullet of content that's going to fix the problem. Sorry, that was probably a very long. You've got two people who are going to give you the long answer to everything today.
No, that was very, very helpful and convincing. Just a quick follow up. How would you talk back to quite a pervasive view that the only solution is to go back into in-person assessments? I'm talking about summative assessments. You know, there's been a shift away from the take-home assessments and portfolios and so on because of anxiety about AI. And I just wondered if you've given some thought to that.
Yeah, but sorry, I
was just saying we have definitely given it in a huge amount of thought. And we're still kind of experimenting. But what we tried this year was what Kate was alluding to. We have gone back into in-person seated assessments, you know, against kind of our instincts that that's not something that we'd like to be doing, but recognizing the kind of current context that we're in. But the way that we tried to mitigate against that was we gave students the question that they would be asked to write on in the seated environment. And we had a series of quite detailed workshops as part of our lab process about workshopping what would be adequate preparation, what should go into those assignments. So while the students did go back to an in-class assessment moment, it wasn't it wasn't a kind of closed book surprise kind of content-based exercise. It was meant to be a concentrated moment of in-person writing based on quite substantial preparation to that point. Look, I will also say that we're not completely convinced. It was a partial solution, and there were some good things about it, but there were also some things that we'll really would like to unpack as part of this larger kind of project of reviewing what these changes have meant. That we're a bit skeptical about it and how it worked. But perhaps it's a work in progress.
Thank you, Kate and Catherine. Do we have more questions for the presenters? I don't see on the. Okay, please go ahead, Mutlajo.
Thanks, Nero. Hi, everyone. Perhaps this is not really a question, but a commentary, because this time I get to be on the other side of the conference. So a couple of years ago, I don't know, I tried to switch on my camera. I don't know what's going on. It's not allowing. I was one of the students that actually had to take VPA. So it was quite a while. We're looking at about 2009, and Catherine was one of the tutors. Yeah, so the commentary or the part that I just wanted to mention was that it's quite nice to get to see how the curriculum of the FVPA takes place on the other side, because I must admit at the time I did not understand why we had to even do FVPA, because it wasn't like my major, but it was compulsory. So yeah, that's all that I just wanted to say. Thanks.
It's a very common refrain around that question of like, why are we doing this? And I think that there are multiple different answers, but I'm always interested to talk to students after graduation and kind of hear. So like we heard from Andrea earlier today about how in retrospect the pieces do tend to, well, at least we hope the pieces kind of start to come together and fall together in a way that's meaningful.
Okay, any more questions? We literally have, I guess, 1 minute. Thank you again, Kate and Catherine. I think for me, it just shows that a lot of work really goes into this, and having started only 6 months ago, it's quite a lot that you guys delivered, and it's with the results that it shows that it's really, I think it's a positive move. And I also like the creativity in the types of assessments that you also presented. So well done for this.
Thank you.
I think yes. So yes, please keep it up. I think for all the audience also, I think we are wowed by this. And please don't forget to just also have your inputs, guys, on the Padlet. There is one person also, please go ahead. I think I just saw a hand. You can go ahead and ask your question, or was it wrong?
You could do the comments in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
No, I was just thinking that, when faculty has created a 4-day design retreat for people to design courses similar to a research retreat, but it's proving to be challenging, for people to take 4 days off. I mean, I think we really need to think creatively, because if you think of all the work that's gone into planning this very carefully thought through flipped classroom approach, yeah, it's so the investment would be so worthwhile if the facilities were available.
Absolutely, and that's what we did. We carved out time, and we took, I think it was 4 days, to really intensively just redesign the entire curriculum, and we almost fell over because of it. But the incremental changes we were making weren't working, and we really needed to completely rethink the whole structure. And we just had to make time for that. But not always possible.
Okay, thank you for that. Very, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I wanted to say just how much I admire you for decreasing lecture time and increasing tutorial time. And there's been a bit of a backlash against tutorials, or I've had 1 or 2 experiences where people have said, no, we don't have tutorials. We only do large lectures, and it goes against everything I know about education. And I just wanted to praise you, or I think that's such an admirable thing that you've done.
Not the easiest or most efficient mode of teaching, but I think essential for a curriculum that has some kind of resilience and accessibility. You know, that if we're going to put accessibility and participation first, then this has been one of the things that has had to change. But yeah, you're quite right, and that is one of those anxieties that we were referring to is what happens when you shift things so radically.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We're a bit over time. Just to remind our participants, please do fill in the evaluation for today. We'll send the link on the chat, and also do remember to put your thoughts on the Padlet as well. So once again, to Kate and Catherine, thank you for their wonderful presentation. And for the participants, thank you for joining the session. And with that, the session is adjourned. Thank you so much. See you tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Excellent talk. Thank you.
Thanks for a great talk. Thanks.